The smoke from the burning barn reaches her before the soldiers do. Sarah Edmondson is standing at the window of her farmhouse in Gordon County, Georgia, watching a column of dark shapes move across the November landscape. She is 26 years old. Her husband Daniel left for the Confederate Army 19 months ago. She has received 4 letters from him since. The last one arrived in August. It said he was alive, that he loved her, that he would come home when the war ended. The war has not ended. The war has come to her instead. She counts the soldiers as they approach. 12 men, maybe 15, moving in a loose formation that suggests they are not regular army. They are carrying torches. One of them is leading a mule that pulls a cart already loaded with what looks like furniture, fabric, items that belonged to someone else before this morning. Sarah's nearest neighbor is the Hartwell farm, 3 miles east. The smoke she sees rising behind the soldiers is coming from that direction. She is alone. Her farmhand, a freedman named Thomas, who stayed after emancipation because he had nowhere else to go, left yesterday to find food in town. Her sister-in-law, Martha, who had been staying with her, rode to Atlanta 2 weeks ago to find news of her own husband. She has not returned. The farmhouse contains Sarah, her stored provisions, her husband's hunting rifle that she does not know how to fire, and approximately 14 minutes before the soldiers reach her door. She knows what foraging parties do. Everyone in Georgia knows. They take food, livestock, valuables, anything that might support the Confederate war effort, or simply anything they want. The newspapers call it requisitioning. The women who survive it call it something else, something they whisper to each other in church pews and quilting circles, something they do not write in letters because letters can be intercepted. Sarah has heard the whispers. She has heard about the Thornton farm in Jasper County, where a foraging party stayed for 3 days. She has heard about what happened to Mrs. Thornton and her 2 adult daughters during those 3 days. She has heard that Mrs. Thornton does not speak anymore, that she sits by her window and watches the road and does not respond when people say her name. The soldiers are closer now. She can see their faces. They are young, most of them. Boys who might have been handsome before the war made them into something else. They are laughing about something. One of them points at her house. Sarah considers her options. She can run. The woods behind the farm are dense enough to hide in, and she knows them well. But running means abandoning everything she and Daniel built, everything they own, the house where they expected to raise children. Running means confirming that she is prey, triggering the chase instinct that she can see even from this distance in the way the men move. She can hide. The root cellar beneath the kitchen has a concealed entrance that Daniel installed 2 years ago, when rumors of raids first began. But hiding means hoping they do not find her, hoping they leave quickly, hoping for mercy from men who have already burned the Hartwell farm. She can stay visible, meet them at the door, offer them food, cooperation, whatever they want that does not involve her body. Hope that daylight and her dignity and the pretense of civilized behavior will protect her from what happens when pretense fails. She has approximately 8 minutes now. The hunting rifle is in the bedroom closet, unloaded, with ammunition in a box on the top shelf. Daniel showed her once how to load it, how to aim, how to brace for the kick. She remembers almost nothing of what he said. She remembers only his hands on hers, guiding the barrel, his voice calm and patient, his certainty that she would never actually need to use it. 6 minutes. The soldiers have reached the fence line. The man in front, the one who pointed, is older than the others. His uniform is officer's rank, but his bearing suggests authority earned through violence rather than promotion. He is looking at the house with an expression that Sarah recognizes from somewhere deep in her memory, from some ancient part of her brain that knows what predators look like when they have found prey. She makes her decision. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from American history textbooks for over 150 years. The official narrative of Sherman's march to the sea describes property destruction, barns burned, railroads torn up, livestock slaughtered. The economic infrastructure of the Confederacy dismantled through total war. The textbooks acknowledge that civilians suffered, that homes were destroyed, that the march was brutal by the standards of its time. The textbooks do not describe what happened to the women. Tonight, I will show you the evidence that survived, despite systematic suppression, the diaries that families hid for generations before donating them to archives with restrictions on access, the letters that officers wrote acknowledging what they could not control, the court-martial records that reveal how rarely soldiers were punished and for what mild offenses, while far worse, went completely unaddressed. You will learn about the foraging parties, small groups of soldiers sent ahead of the main army to requisition supplies from farms where only women remained. You will learn about the bummer squads, the lawless raiders who followed Sherman's army and operated with complete impunity. You will learn about the unwritten policy that made officers complicit through deliberate ignorance. You will learn why the women never reported what happened, why families maintained silence for generations, why the truth was buried so effectively that most Americans today have no idea what Sherman's march actually involved. You will learn what the phrase, "passed her to the regiment," meant in the winter of 1864, why it appeared in soldiers' letters home, in court-martial testimony, in the private writings of men who witnessed things they could not forget. What happened to women whose husbands and fathers were away fighting, whose farms lay in the path of 60,000 Union soldiers moving through Georgia with minimal supervision and maximum impunity? If you want to understand the real history that comfortable narratives conceal, subscribe now and comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, because these women existed. Their suffering was documented by the very men who inflicted it, and for 150 years, their stories have been deliberately erased from the version of history we teach our children. Sarah Edmondson is standing at her window with approximately 4 minutes remaining. Let me tell you what happens when the soldiers reach her door. Sherman's march to the sea began on the 15th of November 1864, when 62,000 Union soldiers departed Atlanta and began moving toward Savannah, 300 miles to the southeast. The strategy was unprecedented in American warfare. Sherman's army would cut itself off from supply lines, living entirely off the land, consuming or destroying everything in its path. The goal was not merely military victory. The goal was the destruction of Southern civilian morale, the demonstration that the Confederacy could not protect its own territory, the breaking of the will to continue fighting. Sherman articulated this philosophy in correspondence that historians have studied extensively. "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people," he wrote, "and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." The hard hand of war fell primarily on women. By November 1864, most able-bodied white men in Georgia were serving in the Confederate Army. The farms and plantations that Sherman's army moved through were occupied by women, children, elderly men, and enslaved people who were in the process of becoming free, but who often had nowhere to go. When foraging parties arrived, they typically encountered households with no male protectors, no weapons, no ability to resist. The official orders regarding foraging were specific, but selectively enforced. Soldiers were authorized to gather food, livestock, and supplies necessary for the army's sustenance. They were prohibited from entering private dwellings without officer supervision. They were forbidden from violence against civilians. These prohibitions existed on paper. They rarely existed in practice. The army moved in multiple columns spread across a front 60 miles wide. Communication between units was limited. Officers could not supervise every foraging party, and many officers chose not to try. The practical reality was that groups of armed men ranged across the Georgia countryside, with minimal oversight, encountering isolated women who had no recourse and no protection. Sherman himself acknowledged the situation in letters that were not published during his lifetime. "I know that in the beginning, I too had the old West Point notion that pillaging was a disgrace," he wrote to a fellow general, "but I am satisfied that the soldiers cannot be kept from it." In another letter, he admitted that soldiers are entitled to enjoy all spoils of war. The word spoils carried implications that Sherman did not specify, but that soldiers understood. The Army's provost marshal, responsible for military discipline, recorded a total of 17 courts-martial for crimes against civilians during the entire March to the Sea. 17 cases across 62,000 soldiers over 37 days, affecting hundreds of thousands of civilians. The charges in these 17 cases were predominantly theft and destruction of property. Only 2 involved violence against persons. Neither of those 2 resulted in serious punishment. The absence of prosecution was the policy. The silence was the system. The man at Sarah's door does not knock. He pushes it open with one boot, his rifle held casually, his eyes moving through the interior of the farmhouse with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times. He is Sergeant William Kearns, 41 years old, a veteran of Shiloh and Chickamauga, who has spent the last 3 weeks leading what the Army officially calls a foraging detail, and what the men themselves call something else. He sees Sarah standing in the center of the main room, her hands visible and empty, her posture communicating submission that she hopes will be interpreted as cooperation rather than weakness. "How many others in the house?" His voice is flat, procedural. This is a question he asks at every farm. "I'm alone." Kearns studies her face for signs of deception. He has learned to read women during these weeks, to identify when they are hiding husbands in root cellars or sons in barn lofts. He sees no deception in Sarah's expression. He sees only fear, which is what he expects to see, what he has seen at every farm since Atlanta. Husband? Serving, 43rd Georgia Infantry. The information means nothing to Kearns beyond confirming what he already assumed. The men are gone. The women are here. The arithmetic of occupation remains consistent across every county they have passed through. "We're requisitioning supplies," he says. "Food, livestock, anything of military value. You can cooperate or you can resist. Cooperation goes easier." Sarah nods. She has rehearsed this moment in her mind for months, imagining what she would say, how she would behave, how she would navigate the transaction of giving them what they want in exchange for being left with something. Anything. Enough to survive until Daniel comes home. "I have corn in the smokehouse," she says. "Some preserved vegetables. A pig and 6 chickens. Take what you need." Kearns gestures to the men behind him. They spread through the farm, moving toward outbuildings, their practiced movements suggesting choreography developed through repetition. 3 of them stay in the main room, watching Sarah, their expressions ranging from boredom to something else that she forces herself not to identify. The search takes approximately an hour. They find everything: the corn, the vegetables, the livestock, the silver candlesticks that belonged to Daniel's grandmother, the quilts that Sarah's mother made before she died, the small cache of Confederate currency hidden beneath the floorboards that represents everything Sarah has saved for emergencies. They load it all onto the cart. The pig squeals as they drag it out. The chickens flutter in protest before necks are wrung with casual efficiency. The farmhouse empties of value while Sarah stands in the center of the main room, watching, calculating what will remain when they leave. The sun is lower now. The afternoon is fading. The column of smoke from the Hartwell farm has thinned to a gray wisp against the darkening sky. Kearns returns to the main room. The cart is loaded. The outbuildings have been stripped. The search, by any reasonable measure, is complete. He should leave now. His orders are to requisition and move on, to cover ground. to strip resources from the path of the main army. He has done this. The mission is accomplished. He does not leave. He looks at Sarah for a long moment, his expression shifting into something that the official orders do not address, something that exists in the space between what soldiers are authorized to do and what soldiers actually do when no one with authority is watching. "The boys have been marching hard," he says. "They could use some rest before we move on." Sarah feels the temperature in the room change. She feels the three soldiers who stayed inside shift their attention, their boredom evaporating into something alert and focused. She understands, in this moment, that the transaction she prepared for is not the transaction she is facing. "There's nothing more to take," she says. Her voice comes out steady, which surprises her. "You have everything." Kearns smiles. It is not a pleasant expression. Not everything. The foraging parties that accompanied Sherman's march operated under a command structure that was deliberately ambiguous. Official records indicate that each corps commander appointed officers to supervise foraging operations. These officers were responsible for ensuring compliance with general orders regarding treatment of civilians, protection of private dwellings, and restrictions on violence. In practice, the supervisory officers rarely accompanied foraging parties into the field. They remained with the main column, receiving requisitioned supplies when the parties returned, documenting the quantities of food and livestock acquired, filing reports that described orderly and disciplined operations. What happened between departure and return was not documented. What happened on isolated farms, miles from the main column, with no witnesses except the women who lived there, this existed in a space that official records did not reach. The soldiers who participated in foraging operations left their own records. Letters home, diaries, memoirs, written decades later when the men were old and perhaps felt compelled to unburden themselves of memories they had carried for years. Private Edward Cutter of the 103rd Illinois Infantry wrote to his brother in December 1864, "The boys take what they want, and the officers don't ask questions. I have seen things on this march that I will not write about because you would not believe them, and Mother would weep if she knew." Sergeant James McDermott of the 55th Ohio wrote in his diary on the 27th of November, 1864, "Visited a farm today where only women remained. The men had their way with them, and I could not stop it, even if I wanted to, which I am not certain I did. This war has made devils of us all." Captain Charles Wills of the 103rd Illinois, an officer who supervised foraging operations, wrote with more circumspection, "I cannot describe the scenes on some of these farms without degrading myself. Suffice to say that discipline has broken down entirely in the outlying parties, and I have given up attempting to restore it." These fragments represent the rare instances where soldiers wrote about what they witnessed. The far more common response was silence letters that mentioned foraging without details, diaries that skipped days entirely, memoirs that described the march in terms of miles covered and supplies gathered, without acknowledging the human cost of acquisition. The women who experienced what the soldiers could not bring themselves to describe left their own fragmentary records. Most did not write at all. Literacy was limited, paper was scarce, and the experiences defied articulation. But some women kept diaries throughout the war, documenting daily life on farms that their husbands had left behind. When Sherman's army passed through, these diaries recorded what happened in language that subsequent generations would struggle to interpret. Dolly Sumner Lunt Burge, a plantation mistress in Newton County, Georgia, wrote on the 19th of November 1864, "Like demons, they rush in. To my smokehouse, my dairy, pantry, kitchen, and cellar. They swear, they curse, they threaten. What manner of men are these?" Her entry continues with descriptions of property destruction that fill a full page. Then, a single sentence appears, almost hidden among the accounts of material loss. To my chamber they rush, and there do I pass the longest night of my life. She does not explain what happened in her chamber. She does not need to explain. The women who read her diary in subsequent years understood what the longest night of my life meant. The men who edited it for publication in 1918 removed that sentence, finding it inappropriate for general audiences. Sarah's longest night begins at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Sergeant Kearns posts a guard outside the farmhouse door. The remaining soldiers, she counts them now, there are 11, in total, make themselves comfortable in her home. They find Daniel's whiskey supply, the bottles he kept for special occasions, for celebrations that will never happen now. They drink steadily as the darkness falls outside. Sarah remains in the main room because they have not told her she can leave. She stands near the fireplace, her back against the stone, watching the men drink and talk and laugh about things that seem impossibly normal card games they have played. Women they knew before the war. Complaints about officers who assign them to foraging duty when they would rather be fighting. They talk about her as though she is not present. Or rather, they talk about her as though her presence is not the presence of a person, as though she is furniture or livestock, an object to be discussed rather than a participant in the discussion. Pretty enough, one of them says. He is young, maybe 20, with a face that might have been kind before 3 years of war eroded whatever kindness it once contained. Officer's wife material, another agrees. Bet the husband's some rich plantation man sitting out the war counting his slaves. Sarah does not correct them. She does not explain that Daniel is an infantry sergeant, that their farm is 40 acres of middling soil, that they have never owned slaves because they could never afford them. She understands that accuracy is not the point. The point is the story they are telling themselves, the justification they are constructing, the narrative that makes what comes next something other than what it actually is. The drinking continues. The evening deepens. The farmhouse fills with smoke from their pipes and the smell of whiskey and the particular tension that builds when violent men are idle and bored. At approximately 8 o'clock, Sergeant Kearns stands up. He does not say anything. He simply walks towards Sarah, his movement unhurried, his expression containing nothing that she can appeal to no mercy, no hesitation, no recognition that she is a person rather than an opportunity. She speaks because speaking is all she has left. Please, I've given you everything. Just take it and go. Kearns stops approximately 2 feet away from her, close enough that she can smell the whiskey on his breath, see the broken blood vessels in his eyes, feel the heat radiating from his body. Your husband's off fighting to keep his property, he says. Slaves, land, whatever else you people think you're entitled to. You started this war. You don't get to decide how it ends. Sarah wants to explain that she never owned slaves, that Daniel never wanted to fight, that they were both conscripted into a conflict that served plantation owners' interests rather than their own. But the explanation would not matter. The explanation would not change what is about to happen. Kearns reaches for her. The bummer phenomenon represents one of the least documented aspects of Sherman's march. Official Army records barely acknowledge their existence. Sherman's own correspondence mentions them only in passing, usually in the context of denying responsibility for their actions. But soldiers' letters and diaries describe them extensively, painting a picture of lawlessness that exceeded even the loosely supervised foraging parties. Bummers were unofficial raiders who followed the army without being formally attached to any unit. Some were deserters from both armies who found the chaos of the march profitable. Some were soldiers who simply separated from their units and operated independently. Some were civilians, opportunists attracted by the prospect of plunder with no consequences. They traveled in groups ranging from a handful to several dozen. They moved ahead of the main army, reaching farms before official foraging parties arrived. They operated with no oversight whatsoever, no officers to maintain even the pretense of discipline, no records kept of their activities. Private Ricebowl of the 123rd New York Infantry described encountering bummers on the 22nd of November 1864. Met a band of men on the road who were neither Confederate nor properly Union. They had women's jewelry pinned to their coats and blood on their hands that they made no effort to wash. They laughed when we asked what regiment they belonged to. The bummers understood something that regular soldiers sometimes forgot. The march to the sea had created a temporary zone where law did not exist. The Confederate authorities had fled. The Union authorities were focused on military objectives. The civilian population was defenseless. In this vacuum, anything was permitted because nothing was enforced. Women who encountered bummers faced something worse than the foraging parties. The regular soldiers, however poorly supervised, at least belonged to a command structure that could theoretically be appealed to. The bummers belonged to nothing. They answered to no one. They left no records because there were no records to leave. The estimates of bummers operating during the march range from several hundred to several thousand. The estimates of their victims do not exist because no one counted, because counting would have required acknowledging that something had happened, because acknowledgement was precisely what the system was designed to prevent. The first soldier finishes with Sarah at approximately 9:30. She has stopped tracking time precisely because precision requires mental presence, and mental presence requires being inside her body, and being inside her body is something she can no longer sustain. She has retreated to a place where she can observe what is happening without fully experiencing it, a psychological refuge that trauma creates when reality becomes unsurvivable. The soldier buttons his trousers and returns to the main room, where the others wait. He says something that makes them laugh. Sarah does not hear the words. She has stopped processing language along with sensation. The second soldier enters the bedroom where she has been taken. She has learned, in the 90 minutes since this began, that resistance increases violence. She has learned that compliance does not reduce it. She has learned that nothing she does or does not do affects what happens, that she has become an object that events happen to rather than a person who participates in events. The second soldier takes longer than the first. When he finishes, a third enters. The pattern continues through the night. Sarah loses count somewhere around the fourth or fifth. The numbers blur together. The faces become indistinguishable. The experience collapses into a continuous present that has no beginning and no end. She thinks about Daniel. She thinks about him in the abstract, as a concept rather than a person, because thinking about him as a person would require considering what he will think when he learns what happened, and that consideration is something she cannot afford right now. She thinks about Daniel as a warm memory from before, from the time when she was a person who had a future, from the world that existed until approximately 5 o'clock this afternoon. She thinks about dying. The thought arrives calmly, without emotional charge, as a practical consideration rather than a dramatic declaration. If she were dead, this would stop. If she were dead, she would not have to face whatever comes after this stops. The logic is simple and appealing, but she does not know how to make herself die, and some part of her, some survival mechanism deeper than conscious thought, refuses to cooperate with the project. The soldiers continue through the night. At some point, gray light begins filtering through the bedroom window. Morning is arriving. The night is ending. Sergeant Kearns enters the bedroom one final time. He looks at Sarah with an expression that might contain something, not remorse, not exactly, but perhaps a recognition that what has happened is something that will require forgetting, that he is going to have to work to not remember this. "We're moving out," he says. "Don't try to follow us. Don't try to report this. There's no one to report to, you understand?" Sarah does not respond. She is not certain she could speak if she tried. Kearns studies her for a moment longer, then turns and leaves. She hears boots on floorboards, voices calling to each other, the sounds of men assembling for departure. She hears them leave. She hears silence settle over the farmhouse like snowfall. She lies on the bed where they left her, watching the light strengthen through the window, waiting for something she is not certain what. Perhaps waiting to feel something. Perhaps waiting to be someone again. She waits for 3 hours before she moves. The aftermath of Sherman's march created a silence that lasted generations. The women who survived did not report what happened because there was no one to report to. The Confederate civil authorities had collapsed. The Union military authorities were the perpetrators. The concept of legal recourse against occupying soldiers did not exist in any practical sense. Even if reporting had been possible, the consequences of reporting would have compounded the harm. A woman who publicly acknowledged what had happened to her would be marked. Her reputation would be destroyed. Her marriage prospects, if unmarried, would evaporate. Her marriage, if married, would be strained by knowledge that 19th century concepts of honor made toxic. The cultural framework of the time placed responsibility for violations on the victims rather than perpetrators. A woman who had been ruined, the period terminology that avoided naming what had actually occurred, was considered damaged goods regardless of her lack of consent. To report was to confess to damage. To confess to damage was to accept a diminished status that would follow her for the rest of her life. So, the women did not report. They maintained silence. They told husbands that the soldiers took property, took food, took valuables, without specifying what else was taken. They let the material losses stand as the complete account, trusting that husbands would not ask questions whose answers would destroy marriages. Some husbands knew anyway. They knew because they understood what armies did, what soldiers did, what occupation meant for women. They knew because they had seen the same things happen in territories they themselves had occupied. They knew, and they did not ask, because asking would require acknowledging, and acknowledging would require response, and response would require them to confront their own helplessness. This mutual silence, this cooperative forgetting, this agreement between husbands and wives to not speak of what could not be unspeaken, this became the foundation of how the March to the Sea was remembered. The property destruction was acknowledged. The agricultural devastation was documented. The economic impact was studied extensively by historians, who found it a safe topic that did not require engaging with more difficult questions. The human cost, the cost measured in women's bodies rather than bushels of grain, was erased, not through active conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of individual silences, each family choosing not to speak, each community choosing not to ask, each generation choosing to pass down the version of history that did not require confronting what had actually happened. Margaret Eberhardt's diary survived because her family did not know it existed. She was 31 years old in November 1864, living on a farm in Butts County, Georgia, with her 2 younger sisters, ages 19 and 23. Her husband was dead killed at Antietam 2 years earlier. Her father was dead heart failure in 1861. The farm was operated by the 3 sisters and 2 hired men who had fled when news of Sherman's approach reached them. Margaret's diary covers the period from November 18 to the 24th of November 1864. It was found in 1987, hidden in a false compartment, in a trunk that had been in her family's attic for over a century. The family donated it to the Georgia Historical Society, with restrictions that limited access until 2020. The entries are written in a small, precise hand that becomes increasingly erratic as the week progresses. November 18. Word has come that the Federal Army approaches, have hidden what silver we have, and sent the horses to Mr. Crawford's farm in hopes they will overlook them. The girls are frightened. I tell them we will be safe if we cooperate. I do not know if I believe this. November 19. Soldiers arrived at noon, a foraging party of 8 men. They took the corn, the chickting, the livestock. They were rough, but did not harm us. Left at dusk. Perhaps we will survive this. November 20. More soldiers today. Different men. These were not like yesterday's. They stayed. The entry for November 20 continues for 3 pages. The handwriting deteriorates. Portions are illegible, where tears or water damage have blurred the ink. What remains readable describes what happened to Margaret and her sisters over the course of the night. November 21. They are gone. Elizabeth will not speak. Catherine will not stop crying. I do not know what to do. There is no one to help. There is no one to tell. We are alone with what has happened. November 22. Blank. November 23. Blank. November 24. We have agreed not to speak of this. Not to each other. Not to anyone. When the war ends and life resumes, we will say the soldiers took our property. That is all we will say. This is the only way to continue living. Margaret Eberhardt never married. Neither did her sisters. They lived together on the farm until they died. Margaret in 1901, Catherine in 1908, Elizabeth in 1912. The family members who inherited the property knew only that the 3 sisters had been reclusive, had rarely left the farm, had maintained a household characterized by silence and routine. The diary explains the silence. The diary documents what created the routine. The diary preserves, in Margaret's increasingly fractured handwriting, the evidence of what Sherman's march actually meant for the women in its path. Sarah Edmondson moves for the first time at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. The movement begins in her feet, a small flexing of toes that sends signals through a body she has temporarily vacated. The signals reach her legs, her arms, her core. Slowly, with effort that seems disproportionate to the simple act of sitting upright, she rises from the bed where the soldiers left her. The bedroom shows evidence of what happened. She does not look at this evidence directly. She looks at the window, at the light, at the world outside that continues existing despite what occurred within these walls. She stands. Her legs support her, which surprises her. She expected them to fail, expected her body to refuse cooperation with the project of continuing to live. But her body has its own agenda, its own survival imperatives that operate below conscious decision. She walks to the door. She walks through the main room, where the soldiers drank and waited and discussed her as though she was not present. She walks to the front door that Kearns pushed open approximately 17 hours ago. Outside, the November air is cold and clean. It tastes different from the air inside the house. It tastes like something that has not been contaminated. She stands on her porch and surveys the damage. The smokehouse is empty. The barn doors hang open, revealing absence where livestock once stood. The garden has been trampled. The chicken coop is a scatter of feathers and broken wood. Everything of material value is gone. But the house still stands. The fields still exist. The well still holds water. The physical infrastructure of the farm, minus its contents, remains. Sarah begins to understand that she will have to decide. She will have to decide whether to stay or leave, whether to wait for Daniel or go find him, whether to continue the project of living that she did not consciously choose, but that her body seems determined to pursue. She will have to decide what to tell Daniel. The decision is not immediate. The decision will take weeks to form, weeks during which Sarah does not speak to anyone because there is no one to speak to, weeks during which she rebuilds enough of the farm's functionality to survive until something changes. But the decision is already forming, already taking shape in the silence of that November morning, already constructing the narrative that will become her official history. She will tell Daniel about the soldiers. She will tell him about the requisitioning. She will tell him about the stolen property and the slaughtered livestock and the ransacked house. She will not tell him about the night. The war has taken his service, his safety, his peace of mind. She will not allow it to take his marriage. She will not allow the soldier's violence to extend beyond herself, to poison the relationship that is the only thing she still values, to destroy what they might rebuild when the war finally ends. This is her decision. It is not the decision she wanted to make. It is the only decision she can make and still continue functioning. She goes back inside to begin cleaning. The letters that William Tecumseh Sherman wrote during and after the March to the Sea have been extensively studied by historians. His official correspondence presents the march as a disciplined military operation. His private letters reveal a more complicated picture. On the 24th of December 1864, after capturing Savannah, Sherman wrote to his wife Ellen, "I know my army is destroying property, and suffering must inevitably follow. But war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. Those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses that follow." The phrase, "suffering must inevitably follow," is characteristic of Sherman's rhetoric, acknowledging harm while denying responsibility, framing cruelty as natural consequence rather than command decision. In January 1865, Sherman wrote to General Henry Halleck regarding complaints about his army's conduct. "If the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty, I will answer that war is war, and not popularity-seeking. If they want peace, they and their relatives must stop the war." This letter has been cited by historians as evidence of Sherman's philosophical approach to total war. What historians have noted less frequently is what the letter does not address. It speaks of barbarity and cruelty in general terms. It does not specify what the barbarity and cruelty consisted of. It does not acknowledge what forms the suffering took. Sherman was not ignorant of what his army was doing. His own staff officers reported on discipline problems. His provost marshal documented the breakdown of command authority in outlying foraging parties. Sherman received complaints from Southern civilians, from Union officers, from his own subordinates about conduct that exceeded military necessity. He chose not to respond effectively. The choice was strategic. Effective discipline would require resources, officers assigned to supervision, courts-martial that consumed time, punishments that affected morale. Sherman needed his army moving quickly, covering ground, destroying infrastructure. The cost of discipline was delay. The cost of indiscipline fell on Southern civilians. Sherman accepted the trade-off. His memoirs, published in 1875, describe the March to the Sea in terms of military achievement. He writes extensively about logistics, strategy, the destruction of railroads and factories. He mentions foraging parties as necessary for army sustenance. He does not mention what foraging parties did beyond gathering food. The omission was deliberate. Sherman was a skilled writer who chose his words carefully. He knew what his army had done. He knew what the soldiers' letters described. He knew what the women's diaries documented. He chose to write around this knowledge, to construct a narrative that acknowledged property destruction while erasing human violation. His narrative became the official narrative. His memoir became the source that subsequent historians cited. His framing the march as military operation, as economic warfare, as strategic necessity, became the framework within which American history understood Sherman's campaign. The women's experiences did not fit this framework, so the women's experiences were excluded. Private Thomas Mitchell's letter home, dated the 3rd of December 1864, was preserved because his sister could not bring herself to destroy it, despite his explicit request. Mitchell was 19 years old, serving in the 113th Ohio Infantry. His letter describes an incident that occurred during foraging operations in Washington County, Georgia. "Dear Martha, The letter begins. I must tell someone what I have seen and done, though I fear you will think less of me afterward. Perhaps I deserve to be thought less of. The letter continues for 4 pages. Mitchell describes arriving at a farm where 3 women lived alone, a mother and 2 daughters, all adults. He describes what his fellow soldiers did while he watched. He describes how he participated when they insisted he join them, when refusing seemed impossible, when the group's momentum carried him past whatever moral boundaries he had maintained until that moment. I did not want to, he writes. I told myself I was being ordered, that I had no choice, that everyone was doing it. These are lies. I had a choice. I chose wrong. I chose what was easy over what was right. I cannot undo what I did. I can only tell you so that someone knows, so that this does not disappear into the silence that covers everything we do here. He concludes, please burn this letter after reading. Do not tell Mother. Do not tell anyone. I only needed someone to know. That is all. Martha Mitchell did not burn the letter. She hid it in a Bible that remained in her family for generations. When the Bible was donated to a historical society in 1954, the letter was discovered. It was sealed in restricted archives until 2018. The letter reveals something that official records obscure. The soldiers knew what they were doing. They knew it was wrong. They did it anyway because circumstances permitted, because consequences were absent, because the system was designed to enable rather than prevent. Mitchell survived the war. He returned to Ohio. He married in 1868. He had children. He never spoke of what happened during the march. But according to family accounts, he suffered from what the period called soldier's heart, nightmares, anxiety, an inability to discuss his war service. He died in 1912, still carrying whatever memories the letter only partially captured. Daniel Edmondson came home in May 1865. The war had ended. Lee had surrendered. The Confederate Army had dissolved. Daniel walked from Virginia to Georgia, 300 miles, because there was no other way to travel, because the railroads were destroyed, because getting home was all that remained. He arrived at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah saw him coming down the road, a thin figure in a threadbare uniform, walking with the particular gait of a man who has walked too far on too little food. She ran to meet him. They embraced in the road, holding each other for a long time, neither speaking because speech seemed inadequate after 19 months of separation, after everything that had happened while they were apart. When they finally walked to the house, Daniel saw the damage. The empty barn, the broken fences, the fields that had gone untended through the winter and spring. He saw the evidence of Sherman's march, the physical traces of the army that had passed through. They took everything, Sarah said. The soldiers. Last November, they took the food, the animals, everything we had. Daniel nodded. He had expected this. Everyone who served in the Confederate Army had heard about the march, had received letters from families describing the destruction. He had walked through the devastated landscape on his way home, had seen farm after farm that looked like his own. We'll rebuild, he said. We're alive. That's what matters. Sarah did not respond. She was standing in the doorway of their house, looking at her husband's face, searching for something recognition, perhaps, or suspicion, or some indication that he knew more than she had told him. She found nothing. Daniel's face showed only exhaustion and relief, the face of a man who had survived war and wanted only to resume the life that war had interrupted. He did not ask what else the soldiers had done. He did not ask about the nights they spent in the house, about why Sarah flinched when he touched her unexpectedly, about why she had developed the habit of checking the road every few minutes, as though expecting someone to appear. Perhaps he knew, perhaps he suspected, perhaps he chose, consciously or unconsciously, not to ask questions whose answers would require him to feel things he could not afford to feel. The silence that Sherman's march created was a collaborative project. The women did not speak. The men did not ask. Together, they constructed a version of history that acknowledged material loss while erasing human cost. Sarah and Daniel rebuilt the farm. They had 3 children over the following years, 2 daughters and a son. They attended church on Sundays. They participated in community life. They appeared, to everyone who knew them, to be a family that had survived the war and recovered. Sarah never told Daniel what happened in November 1864. She never told her children. She never told anyone. She carried the knowledge alone for 43 years until her death in 1908. The secret died with her, or seemed to die, except for the pattern it created, the flinching, the road watching, the way she sometimes grew silent for hours without explanation, the residue of trauma that her family learned to accommodate without understanding. Her granddaughter, born in 1901, would later describe her grandmother as a woman who seemed to be somewhere else, even when she was right in front of you. The granddaughter did not know where Sarah went during those absences. She did not know what memories Sarah was visiting, what November night she was reliving, what soldiers were entering her house again and again in the landscape of her mind. No one knew. That was the point. The historiographical treatment of Sherman's march reveals how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The standard account, established in the late 19th century and perpetuated through the 20th, presents the march as a strategic triumph. Sherman defeated the Confederacy by destroying its economic capacity to wage war. The destruction was extensive but necessary. Civilians suffered, but their suffering was the inevitable consequence of a war they had initiated. This account is not false. Sherman did destroy Confederate economic infrastructure. The march did contribute to Union victory. The Confederacy did bear responsibility for initiating the conflict. But the account is radically incomplete. The historians who established the standard narrative relied predominantly on military records, official correspondence, and memoirs by commanding officers. These sources documented what the Army intended to do and claimed to do. They did not document what the Army actually did in the spaces between intention and claim. The women's diaries that existed were largely inaccessible. They remained in family possession, hidden from public view, protected by descendants who understood that publication would expose family secrets, best left unexposed. When these diaries were eventually donated to archives, they often came with restrictions that limited access for decades. The soldiers' letters that described what happened were similarly sequestered. Families did not want to preserve evidence that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers had participated in atrocities. Letters were burned, lost, buried in attics, and forgotten. The few that survived were scattered across private collections, difficult for historians to locate and assemble into a coherent picture. The court-martial records that might have revealed the extent of the problem were minimal because courts-martial were minimal. The absence of prosecution created an absence of documentation. The system's refusal to acknowledge the crimes produced a historical record that did not contain the crimes. This is how erasure works, not through conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of individual decisions, families choosing silence, archives choosing restrictions, historians choosing sources that did not require engaging with difficult questions. The result is a version of history that Americans learn in schools, that textbooks present as comprehensive, that general knowledge treats as settled. Sherman's march destroyed property. The South suffered. The war ended. What the women experienced is not part of this version. Their suffering is not included in the suffering that Americans are taught to acknowledge. Their stories are not among the stories that American history tells itself. Mary Ann Harris Gay published her memoir, Life in Dixie During the War, in 1892. The memoir describes her experiences during Sherman's occupation of Decatur, Georgia. It is considered one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the march's impact on civilian life. Historians cite it frequently. It has remained in print for over a century. What historians cite less frequently is what Mary Ann's original manuscript contained versus what the published version included. The manuscript was edited before publication. Family members and the publisher agreed that certain passages were inappropriate for public consumption, that they would damage the reputations of individuals and families, that they described events that civilized society should not discuss in print. These passages were removed. The published memoir describes property destruction, food shortages, the terror of occupation. It does not describe what happened to women in the author's neighborhood during the occupation. It does not describe what Mary Ann herself may have experienced, but chose to frame as happening to others. The original manuscript is held by a private collector. Access is restricted. The excised passages have never been published. This pattern, manuscripts edited, diaries redacted, accounts sanitized, appears throughout the documentary record of Sherman's march. The sources that historians rely on are not complete sources. They are sources that have been filtered through layers of family decision, editorial judgment, and cultural prohibition. What remains is the outline of what happened. What has been removed is the substance. The women who survived Sherman's march lived with their knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some, like Sarah Edmondson, maintained silence until death. They integrated their experiences into a continuous narrative of life that did not acknowledge the discontinuity, the rupture, the fundamental change that occurred when soldiers entered their homes. Some developed what 19th century physicians called neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, hysteria diagnostic categories that described symptoms without acknowledging causes. They were treated with rest cures, tonics, institutionalization. They were told their problems were constitutional, temperamental, failures of female biology, rather than responses to external trauma. Some converted their experiences into religious frameworks. They interpreted what happened as divine punishment for Southern sins, as testing that refined faith, as suffering that brought them closer to Christ's own suffering. The religious interpretation provided meaning, however painful, for experiences that otherwise seemed meaningless. Some became advocates, though advocacy required coded language. They supported charitable organizations for fallen women, for women who had been ruined through no fault of their own, for women whose lives had been destroyed by male violence. They understood the euphemisms. They knew what the organizations actually served. Very few spoke directly about what had happened. The social cost of speaking was too high. The consequences of acknowledgement, ostracism, destroyed marriages, families split by shame were too severe. The silence that protected individuals also protected the system, ensuring that the march's true nature remained hidden from public understanding. The last women who experienced Sherman's march directly died in the early 20th century. They took their first-hand knowledge with them. What remains is second-hand diaries and letters preserved by descendants, accounts written down by children who had heard partial stories, the fragmentary record that survived systematic suppression. This is enough to know what happened. The evidence is sufficient to reconstruct the patterns, to understand the system, to recognize that the comfortable narrative is incomplete. But it is not enough to know the full scope. It is not enough to count the victims, to identify every woman who suffered, to measure the total cost. The silence was too successful. The erasure was too thorough. We know enough to understand that we don't know everything, and we will never know everything, because the people who experienced it chose not to tell, and we cannot force the dead to speak. The relevance of this history extends beyond the events themselves. The patterns that Sherman's march revealed, the use of violation as psychological warfare, the complicity of command structures through deliberate ignorance, the silence that victims maintain To avoid additional harm, these patterns recur throughout history, including recent history. The wars in Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, Syria have all featured systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. The international community has developed legal frameworks to address this, including the recognition of rape as a war crime and crime against humanity. These frameworks exist because the patterns were finally acknowledged, because the silence that protected perpetrators was finally broken. But the American acknowledgement remains incomplete. The Civil War is taught as a struggle over slavery, states' rights, national unity, and it was all these things. But it was also a war in which American soldiers committed systematic violations against American civilians, in which command structures enabled rather than prevented atrocities, in which the women who suffered were erased from historical memory. This is American history. This happened in America. Americans did this to other Americans. And for 150 years, the official narrative has refused to fully acknowledge what occurred. Understanding this history is not about assigning guilt to descendants or relitigating the war. It is about accuracy. It is about acknowledging what actually happened rather than what we prefer to believe happened. It is about recognizing that the comfortable narratives we inherit are often incomplete, that erasure is a form of historical violence that extends the original violation across generations. The women of Sherman's March deserve to have their experiences acknowledged. Not exploited, not sensationalized, but acknowledged, recognized, as part of American history, included in the stories we tell about who we are and what we have done. Sarah Edmondson's great-granddaughter discovered her ancestors' story in 2019. She was researching family genealogy, tracing lines back through census records and property documents, reconstructing the family tree that connected her to 19th century Georgia. She found Sarah's name on a marriage certificate, on land deeds, on the grave marker in a small cemetery that still exists. She also found a letter. The letter was written by a neighbor woman in 1866, addressed to a relative in another state. It mentioned Sarah in passing, in a context that suggested knowledge of something that the official family history did not contain. Poor Sarah Edmondson has not been the same since the soldiers came through, the letter read. Her husband returned from the war, but she will barely let him touch her. Everyone knows what happened to women on those farms, but no one speaks of it. I suppose silence is easier than acknowledgement. The great-granddaughter followed this thread. She contacted historians who specialized in the March to the Sea. She learned about the pattern of violence that affected women throughout Georgia. She understood, finally, why her great-great-grandmother had been a woman who seemed to be somewhere else. She shared this information with her family. The response was mixed. Some relatives wanted to know more. Others preferred the silence that had protected them from difficult knowledge for generations. The family had to decide, collectively, whether to continue the erasure or to finally acknowledge what Sarah had experienced and hidden. They chose acknowledgement. The choice did not change what happened. It did not repair the damage. It did not bring Sarah back or give her the justice that was never available to her. But it ended the silence, at least within one family, after 150 years. This is what acknowledgement looks like. Not sensationalism, not exploitation. Simply recognition that a woman who suffered deserves to have her suffering recognized. That silence serves perpetrators rather than victims. That historical accuracy matters even when accuracy is painful. Sarah Edmondson existed. She survived Sherman's March. She never told anyone what happened to her. Now someone knows. The November afternoon fades toward evening as the soldiers approach Sarah's farmhouse for the first time. She is standing at the window, watching them come, counting the minutes she has remaining, making decisions that will shape the rest of her life. She does not know yet what will happen. She knows only that something is about to happen, something that will divide her life into before and after. something that she will carry alone because the alternative to carrying it alone is unthinkable. 12 men, maybe 15. Torches in their hands. The smell of smoke from the Hartwell farm drifting on the wind. Approximately 14 minutes remaining. She will not run. She will not hide. She will meet them at the door and offer cooperation and hope that cooperation is enough. It will not be enough, but she does not know that yet. She knows only that the soldiers are coming, that her husband is far away, that she is alone in a farmhouse in Georgia in the path of an army that answers to no one for what it does to women like her. She makes her decision. She waits for them to arrive. This happened, not to a character in a story, but to women whose names we know and women whose names were erased, to families whose silence protected secrets for generations, to a nation that has never fully acknowledged what its armies did during its most celebrated war. The textbooks will continue teaching that Sherman's march destroyed property. The monuments will continue commemorating military strategy. The comfortable narrative will continue providing comfort to those who prefer not to know. But now you know. You know about the foraging parties and the bummer squads. You know about the unwritten policy and the absent courts-martial. You know about the women's diaries and the soldiers' letters and the silence that lasted 150 years. You know what "passed her to the regiment" meant in the winter of 1864. You know why Sarah Edmondson and Margaret Eberhardt and the thousands of women like them never told anyone what happened. Why they chose silence over acknowledgement. Why they let the property destruction stand as the complete account while carrying the rest alone until they died. You know now because someone finally told you. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories exposed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who believes they understand the Civil War, who thinks the textbook version is complete, who has never considered what Sherman's march meant for the women in its path. They were real. They suffered. They deserved better than erasure. This is their acknowledgement. 150 years late, but finally spoken. Remember them.